They say the most dangerous men don't raise their voices, they lower the room around them. The rain followed me all the way down Fifth Avenue, soaking through my coat, dripping from my curls, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and white across the pavement. And by the time I pushed open the heavy glass door of the lounge, my fingers were numb and my patience was gone. I wasn't supposed to be here, not in a place where a single drink cost more than my weekly groceries, not surrounded by people who wore silence like a status symbol. But the storm outside didn't care about where I belonged, and neither did the ache in my chest that had nowhere else to go. So I stepped inside anyway, heels clicking softly against polished marble, drawing a few glances I pretended not to notice, scanning for an empty seat. Just one, somewhere I could sit for a while without being asked questions I didn't want to answer, but every table was full, every booth claimed, every space occupied by people who looked like they had never had to ask permission to exist, until I saw it. A table in the corner, dimly lit, untouched, like a blank space in a painting no one dared to fill. And at that table sat a man, alone, still, a glass of something dark in his hand, his suit perfectly tailored, his presence heavier than the room itself. People didn't look at him, not directly. They curved around him, like gravity bent in his direction. And I should have walked away. I should have found somewhere else or gone back into the rain. But something in me was too tired to care about. Invisible rules, too exhausted to keep choosing safe. So I walked toward him, step by step, feeling the air change the closer I got, like the temperature dropped without warning, my heart tapping faster against my ribs, not from fear exactly, but from awareness, like my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. And when I reached the table, I didn't sit right away. I paused, fingers brushing the edge of the chair, my voice quieter than I intended when I spoke. "Can I sit here with you for a while?" The words felt small the second they left me, swallowed by the music, by the low hum of conversations, by the weight of him. And he didn't answer, not with words, not with a nod, not even with a glance at first. He just stilled the glass in his hand, stopping halfway to his lips. And then his eyes shifted slowly, deliberately, landing on me like a spotlight that didn't ask permission. And for a second, everything else disappeared, the music, the voices, the rain. It was just that look, dark, steady, unreadable, like he was measuring something I couldn't see. And I felt it, the instinct to back away, to apologize, to pretend I hadn't spoken at all, but I didn't move. I stayed there, hand still on the chair, breath held somewhere between leaving and staying, and around us, I could feel it, the subtle shift, the way conversations softened, the way a server hesitated mid-step, the way no one came closer to this table anymore, like I had crossed into a space that didn't belong to me. And maybe it didn't, maybe this was a mistake, maybe I had just chosen the worst possible place to land on the worst possible night. But he still hadn't told me no, and that silence, it wasn't empty, it wasn't indifference, it was something else, something controlled, something intentional, like permission given without words. And slowly, carefully, I pulled out the chair and sat down across from him, my hands resting in my lap to keep them from shaking, aware of every inch of distance between us, aware of how close I was to something I didn't understand. And still, he said nothing, just watched me, like he had already decided something I hadn't been invited to hear yet. No one interrupted him, and somehow that told me more than if someone had. The chair beneath me felt too soft, too expensive, like it did not trust me to belong there, and I kept my back straight, my hands folded, my eyes carefully not wandering too far, because everything about this place whispered rules I did not know. But him, he did not whisper anything. He did not need to. His presence filled the space in a way that made silence feel louder than noise. And still, he said nothing, not a word, not even a polite acknowledgement, just that steady gaze that did not blink too often, did not rush, did not apologize. Like time itself moved differently around him. And I found myself wondering how long I had been sitting there before I realized I was holding my breath. So I let it out slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax, pretending this was normal, pretending I had not just walked into something I did not understand. I just needed somewhere quiet. I added, my voice softer this time, not really expecting a response. More like explaining myself to the air between us, but again, nothing, just the faint clink of glass as he finally set it down on the table, precise, controlled, like every movement was measured and chosen. And that was when I noticed his hands, not rough, not careless, but steady, deliberate, the kind of hands that did not waste motion. And for a second, I forgot to be nervous because there was something almost calm about it, something that did not match the tension in the room around us. And then I felt it again. That shift, subtle but undeniable. A server approached our table, stopped 3 steps away, hesitated like she was waiting for a signal she had not received, and then quietly turned and walked away without asking for an order, without even looking at me. And that was when it clicked. This was not just a man sitting alone. This was someone the entire room moved around without being told to, someone who did not need to speak to be obeyed. And suddenly, my choice to sit here did not feel small anymore. It felt like stepping into a story I had not been invited to. I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly in my lap. And for the first time, I let my eyes meet his fully, not just a glance, but a real look, try to read something, anything, but his expression did not change. It did not soften. It did not harden. It just was like a locked door that did not care if you knocked. And then, finally, after what felt like minutes, but could have been seconds, he spoke, his voice low, even not raised, not sharp, just certain. "You do not belong here," the words were simple, but they landed heavier than anything else in the room. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true, and I felt that truth settle into my chest, not as an insult, but as a fact I had known the second I walked in, and still, I did not stand up, I did not apologize, I did not leave. I just tilted my head slightly, meeting his gaze without looking away. "Neither do storms," I said quietly, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. But they still passed through. For a moment, nothing moved, the music continued. Glasses clinked somewhere far away. But at this table, time held still again, and something shifted in his eyes, not warmth, not exactly, but recognition. Like he had not expected that answer, like I had said something that did not fit the script he was used to. And then he leaned back slightly, just enough to change the distance between us, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting. And his next words came slower, more deliberate. "And you think this is a place to wait out a storm?" I could have laughed, but I did not, because something told me this was not a question about weather. No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think this is where storms begin." And for the first time since I sat down, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but something close enough to feel like a line had just been crossed, not by him, but by me. Power does not announce itself. It lets you discover it the hard way. I did not know why that thought crossed my mind, but it settled there the moment the air changed again, sharper this time, heavier, like something unseen had just entered the room without opening a door, and I felt it before I saw it. The way conversations nearby thinned out, the way a glass stopped midair at the next table, the way a woman near the bar lowered her voice instinctively. And then I noticed him, not the man in front of me, but another one approaching from the side, too confident, too unaware, his steps uneven in a way that suggested more courage than clarity, and I knew that type. Not dangerous because of power, but because of ignorance, and ignorance in a place like this felt louder than shouting. He did not look at the man across from me the way everyone else did. He looked at me instead, like I was the only thing that existed at this table, like he had already decided something without asking permission. "Hey," he said, casual, too casual, stopping just close enough to make my shoulders tense. "I think you are in the wrong seat." His voice carried a smile that did not reach his eyes, and for a second, I considered answering, explaining, diffusing, doing what I had always done in situations that felt uncertain, but I did not get the chance, because the man across from me moved, not quickly, not aggressively, just enough. His hand lifted slightly from the table, 2 fingers tapping once against the glass surface, a sound so soft it should have been nothing, and yet it cut through everything. The other man stopped mid-sentence like someone had pressed pause on him, confusion flickering across his face, as if he had just realized he had stepped into something he did not understand. And for the first time since he approached, his attention shifted, not fully, just enough to register who else was sitting there. And I watched it happen. That moment when awareness replaced confidence, when something unspoken passed between them, something I could not hear but could feel, and the man's posture changed, not dramatically, just a slight adjustment, a step back that looked almost accidental, almost like he had simply reconsidered his direction. Actually, he muttered, clearing his throat, never mind. And just like that, he turned away, disappearing back into the crowd, as if he had never been there at all. No. Scene, no raised voices, no explanation, just absence. And I sat there, my heart still catching up to what had just happened, trying to understand how something so small could feel so significant. And slowly, I looked back at the man across from me, because now I knew whatever this was, whatever space I'd stepped into, it was not empty, it was controlled, carefully, quietly, completely. And he was watching me again. Not the man who had just left, not the room, just me like none of that had. Required his attention beyond a single gesture, like it had already been handled before I even realized there was something to handle. You see, he said, his voice low, steady, almost conversational. But there was something under it now, something more defined. This is not a place to wait. The words settled between us, heavier than before, because now I understood. A little more of what they meant. This was not just a table, not just a quiet corner. This was a line, and I had crossed it the moment I sat down. I exhaled slowly, my fingers relaxing against my lap. The fear still there, but no longer sharp, no longer overwhelming, just present like the rain outside, constant but manageable. Then why did you let me stay? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because that was the part one could not piece together, the silence, the permission, the way he had not sent me away when it would have been easier to do so. And for the first time, he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, not away, but through me, like he was considering something that did not have a simple explanation. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but somehow more certain than before. Because you did not ask like you were afraid. And something about that answer settled deeper than anything else he had said. Not comfort, not reassurance, but recognition, like he had seen something in that moment I had not even realized I was showing. And I felt it then, the shift inside me, subtle but real, the understanding that this was not random, that sitting here had not been invisible, that somehow, in a room full of people who knew exactly where they belonged, I had been the only one who did not. Act like I needed permission to exist, and that had changed something. Silence can feel like safety until you realize it belongs to someone else. The words echoed somewhere in the back of my mind as I sat there across from him, the weight of what he had just said settling deeper than I expected, because it was not just about fear, it was about choice, and suddenly I became aware of mine. The fact that I had walked in, chosen this table, chosen to stay, and now I was sitting in a place where nothing felt accidental anymore. Not even the way the dim light caught the edge of his glass. Not even the way the room seemed to breathe differently around him. And for the first time since I sat down, I noticed something else. Not in him, but around him, the structure of it all, the way people moved in quiet patterns, the way certain eyes lingered a second too long before looking away, the way the staff never approached directly, but always circled, like there were invisible boundaries drawn around this table that no one crossed without reason. And I realized then, this was not just power, this was control, practiced, refined, unspoken, and I had stepped into it without understanding the rules. What is your name? The question came from him, unexpected, low, but this time there was no distance in it, no dismissal, just a direct line drawn between us, and for a second I hesitated, not because I did not know my own name, but because saying it here felt like giving something away, something I cannot take back. But then again, I'd already sat down, had already stayed. So what difference would one more step make? Naomi, I said quietly, watching the way the words seemed to settle between us, like it had. Wait now, like it meant something different in this space than it had 10 minutes ago. And he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like he was acknowledging more than just a name. Adrian, he replied. And it was strange hearing it out loud because it did not sound like the kind of name people whispered about. It sounded simple, almost ordinary, but nothing about him felt ordinary, and that contrast stayed with me. The way something so simple could carry so much presence. You are not from here, Naomi, he continued, not as a question, but as an observation, and I almost smiled at that because of course I was not. It was written in everything about me, the way I sat, the way I looked at the room, the way I noticed things that everyone else ignored. No, I admitted, my voice steady now, more grounded than before. I just needed a place to sit that was not everything else. I gestured slightly toward the room, not fully explaining, but somehow knowing he understood anyway, because his gaze did not change. It just held like he was reading between words instead of listening to them. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence returning, but it felt different now. Less like tension and more like something shared, something balanced on a line neither of us was rushing to break. And then, quietly, a glass appeared at my side, placed gently on the table by someone I had not seen approach. No words, no interruption, just presence and retreat. And I looked at it, then back at him, confusion flickering across my face before I could hide it. I did not order anything, I said almost to myself, but he heard it. Of course he did. We did not need to. He replied simply. And there was again that same quiet certainty, that same understanding that things moved here without being asked, that decisions were made before they were spoken. And I hesitated, my fingers brushing the edge of the glass, unsure whether to accept something I had not chosen, unsure what accepting it meant in a place like this. And he watched me, not impatient, not pushing, just waiting like he already knew what I would do before I did. And slowly, I picked it up, not because I was comfortable, not because I understood, but because something in me refused to step back now, refused to pretend I had not already crossed the line. And as the glass touched my lips, I realized something I had not expected. I was no longer just passing through this storm. I was standing at the center of it. The moment you accept something in a place like this, you become part of it. The thought came quietly, almost like it was not mine, as the glass rested in my hand, cool against my fingers, heavier than it should have been, and I realized it was not the drink itself. It was what it represented, the silent agreement, the unspoken acknowledgement that I was no longer just a stranger passing through. And across from me, Adrian watched, not closely, not intensely, just steadily, like he had already accounted for this moment before it happened. And I hated how aware that made me feel, how seen, how placed. I took a small sip, not because I wanted to, but because not doing it felt like stepping backward. And I'd already come too far to pretend I could go back to who I was before I walked in. The taste was smooth, unfamiliar, something expensive and intentional. And I set the glass down carefully, my movement slower now, more deliberate, mirroring his without meaning to. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else. You do not hesitate as much anymore, he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and I glanced up at him, caught between wanting to deny it and knowing there was no point. Maybe I'm just tired of overthinking every step. I replied, and for a second, something in his expression shifted, not quite approval, not quite curiosity, but something that felt attentive, like he was adjusting the way he saw me in real time. And the silence returned again, but did not press down on me the way it had before. It stretched. Instead, like a space I was learning how to exist inside, without shrinking. And then I noticed it, the subtle change in the room once more, not sharp, not immediate, but gradual, like a tide pulling back before it moved forward again. A group near the bar shifted positions. A man in a tailored coat stepped inside from the rain, shaking off droplets as he scanned the room with the kind of confidence that did not belong to someone unfamiliar. And even from where I sat, I could feel it, the difference. This was not like the man from before. This one understood something, carried himself differently, and his eyes landed on Adrian almost instantly, recognition flashing across his face before anything else. And for the first time since I've been sitting here, Adrian's attention shifted away from me, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence without fully turning, and that small movement told me everything. This was someone who mattered, not because of what he would say, but because of how Adrian chose to respond. The man approached, stopping at the edge of the invisible boundary I had crossed earlier, not stepping into it, just standing there, waiting, and I watched the exchange unfold without words. A glance, a slight incline of the head, something silent but complete, like an entire conversation had already taken place without sound. And then Adrian spoke, not to me this time, but not loudly enough for anyone else to claim it either. Later, he said, a single word, calm, final. And the man nodded immediately, stepping back without question, without delay, disappearing into the room just as seamlessly as he had entered it. And I blinked, trying to process how something so brief could carry so much weight, how one word could redirect another person entirely. And slowly, my gaze returned. To Adrian, because now I understood more clearly than before. This was not just control. This was influence, quiet, precise, absolute. And I felt it then, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharper than anything else, the realization that sitting here had placed me inside something structured, something intentional, something that did not happen by accident. And yet, I was still here, still choosing not to leave. You could have asked me to move, I said softly, the question finally surfacing because it had been there since the beginning, waiting. You could have said no, and this time he did not take long to answer, his gaze settling back on me fully, steady, unbroken. And you would have listened? The question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was honest. And I held his gaze for a moment, considering it, weighing it against everything I had done since I walked in, every choice that had led me here, and slowly I shook my head just once. No, I admitted, and something in his expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been confirmed rather than crossed. And then he leaned back slightly, his voice quieter now, but somehow more certain than before. Exactly. And for the first time since I stepped out of the rain, I understood something clearly. This was never about permission. It was about recognition. Some people walk into a room and disappear. Others walk in and rewrite the air without touching anything. I felt that difference now more than ever, not just in Adrian, but in myself. In a way, I was still sitting across from him when every logical part of me should have already left. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm against the glass, but inside, the atmosphere remained unchanged, controlled, deliberate, like time itself had been filtered before it reached this table. And I realized something quietly unsettling. I was no longer measuring how long I had been here. I had stopped checking, stopped counting, like this moment existed outside of the rest of my night. And that awareness made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from something harder to name, something that felt like stepping deeper into water without knowing how far it went. You were thinking too much again, Adrian said, his voice calm, almost distant, but precise enough to land exactly where my thoughts had been. And I blinked, caught off guard by how easily he had read me. Maybe, I admitted, exhaling slowly. Or maybe I'm finally realizing where I am sitting. And this time, there was no pause before his response, no delay, just a quiet certainty that felt like it had been waiting for me to catch up. And where is that? He asked, his gaze steady, unbroken. And I hesitated, not because I did not have an answer, but because saying it out loud felt like confirming something I could not undo. But I had already come this far, already stepped into this space without permission. So I met his eyes fully, letting the words settle before I spoke them. Somewhere people do not sit by accident. The moment the sentence left me, I knew it was right, not because he confirmed it, but because of the way the silence responded, the way nothing in the room contradicted it. And for the first time, Adrian leaned forward slightly, just enough to shift the balance of the space between us, not closing the distance, but redefining it. No, he said quietly, his voice lower now, more deliberate. They do not. And there was something in that agreement that felt different from everything else he had said, something closer to acknowledgement than observation. And I felt it, that shift again, not around me this time, but inside, like I was no longer just reacting to this place. I was beginning to understand it, piece by piece, detail by detail. And that understanding came with a strange kind of calm, not comfort, but clarity. And then, without warning, the door opened again, a sharper sound this time, louder than before, not because it was aggressive, but because it carried urgency. And the room responded instantly, not dramatically, but noticeably. A few heads turned, a few conversations paused just a fraction too long, and I followed that shift, my gaze moving toward the entrance where a woman stepped inside, her posture straight, her presence composed, but purposeful. Like she had come here with a reason that did not leave room for hesitation. And even before she moved, I could tell this was not someone who drifted through spaces. This was someone who entered them with intention. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, efficiently, and when they landed on our table, they did not widen. They did not hesitate. They simply focused, like she had found exactly what she was looking for. And she walked toward us, each step measured, controlled, stopping at the same invisible line the others had respected. And for the first time since I've been sitting here, I felt it clearly, the difference between being allowed in and being kept out, because she did not try to cross it. She did not assume she could. She waited And Adrian did not move right away, did not acknowledge her immediately, his attention still on me, as if this moment between us had not yet finished. And when he finally spoke, it was not to her, not yet, but to me, his voice quieter than before, but carrying more weight than anything he had said so far. This is where you decide. And something about that sentence settled into me instantly, because I understood it without needing an explanation. This was not about the room, not about the people, not even about him. It was about me, about whether I stayed in the space now that I knew what it was, now that I understood that nothing here was accidental. And for a second, everything else faded again. The woman waiting, the room watching, the rain outside, all of it distant compared to the question sitting between us. And I realized something then, something simple but undeniable. I'd already made my choice the moment I sat down. I just had not admitted it yet. And slowly, without looking away, I let out a quiet breath, my voice steady, certain in a way it had not been before. I already did. The moment you admit a choice out loud, it stops being a possibility and becomes a path. My words stayed there between us, steady, undeniable. And for the first time since I'd walked in, I felt something shift completely, not in the room, not in him, but in myself, like I had crossed an invisible line I could not uncross. And across from me, Adrian held my gaze a second longer than before, not testing, not questioning, just confirming, like he had been waiting to see if I would understand what this was before deciding what came next. And then, slowly, he leaned back, the tension in the space easing just enough to let something else exist there, something quieter, more settled. And only then did his attention move, just slightly, toward the woman who had been waiting at the edge of his world, still standing exactly where she had stopped, still not crossing the boundary, like she understood it better than anyone else in the room. "You can speak," Adrian said, his voice calm, directed toward her now, but it did not break the space between us. It simply expanded it, and the woman stepped forward just enough to be heard, her posture still composed, her expression controlled. But there was something in her eyes, something urgent that she was holding back out of respect for where she stood. "There's a situation," she said carefully, her tone measured, each word placed with intention, like she knew that nothing unnecessary should exist in a moment like this. And I felt it immediately, the difference, the shift from quiet tension to something more defined, something structured. And for a second, I wondered if I should move, if this was the point where I stepped back out of something that clearly was not mine, but I did not. I stayed exactly where I was because he had not told me to leave, and somehow that mattered more than anything else. Adrian's gaze did not leave me immediately, even as she spoke, like part of his attention remained anchored here. And he asked, his voice low, not rushed, not concerned, just expectant, and the woman hesitated for the briefest moment, not from uncertainty, but from awareness, like she was deciding how much to say in front of me. And I saw it then, the question she did not voice, the calculation, whether I belonged in this conversation or not. And before she could answer it for herself, Adrian spoke again, not looking at her, but at me, his voice quieter this time, but carrying more weight than anything else he had said. "Stay." The word was simple, but it settled over everything, over her hesitation, over my uncertainty, over the entire moment, like a decision had been made without needing to explain it. And the woman nodded once, accepting it immediately, adjusting her stance slightly, as if that single word had clarified everything she needed to know. "There has been movement," she continued, her voice steady again, not direct, but close enough to matter. And I did not know what that meant, not exactly, but I understood the tone, the implication, the kind of information that did not need details to feel significant. And Adrian listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his stillness now, something sharper beneath the surface, like he was already processing what she had said before she finished saying it. "Handled?" he asked, and the question was not about whether it could be, it was about whether it already had been. And she inclined her head slightly, contained for now, and there was a pause, brief but complete, like the situation had been placed into a box and set aside for later, not dismissed, just controlled. And then, just as easily as it had shifted, the room settled again, the tension easing back into its previous rhythm, the quiet returning to something familiar. and Adrian's attention came back to me fully, like none of that had disrupted the space between us, like it had simply passed through without leaving a mark. "You see the difference now," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and I nodded slowly because I did. I saw it more clearly than before. This was not chaos, not unpredictability. This was something structured, something managed, something that moved quietly, but deliberately beneath the surface of everything else, and somehow, without realizing when it happened, I had become part of the moment where those layers met, and I let out a slow breath, my voice softer now, but certain. "Nothing here happens without you knowing." And for the first time since I had spoken to him, Adrian's expression shifted in a way that was unmistakable, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to feel like something had aligned exactly where it was supposed to. "Nothing here happens without me allowing it," he corrected calmly. And that difference, that was everything. Power is not proven in what a man controls, but in what he chooses not to disturb. His correction lingered in the air, precise, deliberate, and I felt it settled deeper than anything else he had said, because it reframed everything. This was not just a man aware of what happened around him. This was a man who decided what was allowed to exist at all. And suddenly the room felt different again, not heavier, not lighter, but clearer, like I could finally see the structure beneath it instead of just feeling it. And across from me, Adrian had already moved on from the moment, his posture relaxed again, his glass untouched for the past few minutes, like nothing required urgency unless he gave it meaning. And I found myself watching him differently now, not trying to understand who he was, but how he functioned, the precision, the restraint, the way even silence became a tool in his hands. "You are not surprised," he said after a moment, his voice low, observant. And I shook my head slightly, not because I had expected any of this, but because surprise felt too simple for what I was experiencing now. I think I stopped expecting anything the moment I sat down, I admitted, and there was a quiet honesty in that statement that surprised even me, because it was true. This was no longer about reacting. It was about observing, understanding, choosing to stay in something I could not fully predict, and for a second, something in his gaze shifted again, not approval, not curiosity, but something closer to recognition, like I had reached a point he had already seen coming. "That is when people start seeing clearly," he replied, and the words felt less like advice and more like a statement of fact, like clarity was not something given, but something earned by stepping into uncertainty and not retreating from it. And I let that sit with me, the weight of it, the quiet challenge inside it. And then I became aware of something else, something subtle but undeniable. The room had changed again, not in tension, not in urgency, but in attention. It was quieter now, not because the music had stopped or the conversations had ended, but because something had shifted beneath them. A few glances lingered longer than before, a few movements slowed just slightly, like the space around this table had become more visible to those who understood it. And I realized what that meant. It was not just in being seen anymore. It was us. And that realization settled differently, not uncomfortable, not overwhelming, but defining, like I had stepped from the edge of something into the center of it without noticing when it happened. "They are watching," I said quietly, not looking away from him because I did not need to. I could feel it without turning my head. And he did not deny it, did not dismiss it, just acknowledged it in the simplest way possible. "They always do," he said, and there was no concern in his voice. No reaction to it, just acceptance, like being observed was part of the structure, part of the world he existed in. And for a second, I considered what that meant for me, for someone who had walked in from the rain, who had only wanted a place to sit, and now found herself at a table that no one approached without reason, under a gaze she had not asked for, but had not rejected either. And strangely, it did not make me want to leave. It made me more aware, more present, like every small decision carried more weight now. And I found myself leaning slightly forward, not intentionally, just enough to close a fraction of the distance between us. "So what happens next?" I asked, the question quiet but real, because for the first time since this began, I was not just reacting to the moment, I was asking about what came after it. And Adrian studied me for a second, his gaze steady, measuring something I could not fully define. And then, slowly, deliberately, he set his glass down, the soft sound grounding the moment in a way nothing else had. "That depends," he said, his voice lower now. more focused, like the room itself had narrowed to just this conversation on whether you understand what staying here means. And there was not a warning, not a threat, just a truth placed in front of me without decoration, and I felt it, the weight of the question beneath the question, not about the table, not about the night, but about everything that came with it, the attention, the structure, the unspoken rules I was only beginning to see. And I held his gaze, not looking away, not rushing to answer, because this time I knew better than to respond without understanding. And slowly, carefully, I let out a breath, my voice steady, grounded in something deeper than curiosity now. "Then explain it to me," I said, and the moment the words left my lips, I knew whatever came next. I was not just sitting here anymore. Some doors do not open with force. They open the moment you understand what they cost. His eyes did not leave mine when I asked him to explain, and for a second, the world outside this table faded again. The rain, the music, the quiet movement of people who knew better than to get too close, all of it became background to something more precise, more intentional. And Adrian did not rush his answer. He did not fill the silence just to break it. He let it sit, let it settle, like he was giving me time to reconsider the question before he chose to respond. But I did not take it back. I held his gaze steady, grounded, and that seemed to be enough, because finally he spoke, his voice low, measured, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. "Staying here means you are seen," he said, and it sounded simple, almost obvious, but the way he said it made it heavier, like being seen was not passive, like it carried weight I had not fully accounted for yet. "Not just tonight," he continued, "not just in this room." And I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes right before understanding. "It means people will remember you sat here," he added, and suddenly the glances I'd felt earlier made sense, not curiosity, not random attention, but recognition. Something recorded, something noted without being written down, and I realized then this was not about a seat at a table. It was about being placed within a system I could not see, but was already part of. "It means," he went on, his voice quieter now, but somehow sharper, "that you do not get to go back to being unnoticed." And there it was, the cost, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but permanent in a way that mattered more than anything loud or obvious. And I let that settle into me. Let it move through everything I thought I understood about this moment, about this night, about the simple decision to ask a question in a room that did not belong to me. And for the first time since I walked in, I looked away from him just for a second, letting my gaze drift across the room, seeing it differently now. The people, the movement, the quiet structure beneath it all. And I realized something else. I was not invisible here anymore. I had crossed that line. The moment I chose to stay, and I could feel it, not just in the way others looked, but in the way I held myself now, more aware, more deliberate, like I had stepped into a version of myself that could not pretend this was just a passing moment. And slowly I looked back at him, my voice steady, quieter than before, but stronger. "And if I leave?" I asked, because I needed to hear it, needed to understand if there was still an edge to this I could step back to. And Adrian did not hesitate this time, his answer immediate, certain. "You can walk out that door," he said, his tone calm, unchanging, "but you will not leave this behind." And something about the way he said it made it clear this was not a threat, not a warning, just a fact like gravity or time, something that did not require belief to exist. And I felt it then, fully, the weight of everything he had said, the shift that had already happened, the truth that I had already become part of something simply by choosing not to walk away when I had the chance. And strangely, instead of pulling back, instead of fear pushing me away from it, I felt something else, something quieter but stronger, a sense of clarity, of understanding that did not come with panic, but with acceptance, because deep down I knew I had not stayed by accident. I had not sat down without knowing, at least on some level, that this would change something. And I let out a slow breath, my fingers relaxing against the table, my posture steady, grounded in a way that felt different from before. And when I spoke again, my voice did not waver, did not question. It simply stated what had already become true, that I am not leaving. And for the first time since this began, Adrian's gaze shifted in a way that was unmistakable, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to feel like something had just locked into place, something final, something inevitable, and he nodded once slow, deliberate, like he had been expecting that answer long before I realized it myself. And then, quietly, almost like a statement meant only for me, he said, "Good." And in that single word, I understood everything, not about him, not about the room, but about the choice I had just made. Because some moments do not change your night. They change the direction of your life.